minutes. Then we will have a short discussion here. Then I will open the floor for Q&A. Okay, Dr. Todd Green.
Good morning.
At the title of the speech, he is going to talk about political and cultural factors for the rise of Islamophobia.
So about a year ago, around this time, I was involved in a little bit of a controversy in the United States about Islamophobia. It happened at the campus of Gettysburg College, which is in Pennsylvania. And what had happened is that a very conservative political organization on that campus, known as the Young Americans for Freedom, invited the noted anti-Muslim hate speaker Robert Spencer to give a lecture on the dangers of Islamic fundamentalism. And this caused a big uproar on the campus and a lot of tension about whether the administration of the college should proceed with allowing him to come to campus. And long story short, they did under the premise of freedom of speech. But concerned students and staff and faculty wanted to have a counter speaker. So they invited me. And I came a few days before to give a lecture on the dangers of the Islamophobia industry and to shed light on the political and financial motivations behind people like Robert Spencer in terms of the manufacturing of anti-Muslim hatred in the United States. And my point here is not to talk about what lecture I gave, but to talk about something that happened after my lecture, which is for the first time in my career, I was given a security escort back to my hotel because of anxieties and fears about what might happen. Some of this had to do with the anxiety on campus about Robert Spencer. I think a lot of it had to do with anxiety in the United States about Islamophobia, and this idea that now even giving a public lecture on Islamophobia is enough to bring in extra security. And you have to keep in mind that I'm a religious historian by training. I don't normally need security, right? No one comes to listen to me anyway. So this idea of having security present, not just present, which I've grown accustomed to now, but to escort me back to my hotel in a small town in Pennsylvania says something, right? It speaks volumes, I think, to the political and cultural moment we find ourselves in when a lecture on Islamophobia, or on Islam for that matter, requires not only the presence of security, but the necessity of a security escort. It demonstrates that, like it or not, people like Robert Spencer seem to be winning right now. They seem to have won in terms of dictating the narrative of Islam and doing whatever they can to put communities and the United States as a whole on edge when it comes to our Muslim neighbors. But how did we get here? To this place in which Islamophobia has become so infused into the political and cultural ethos of the United States and in Europe that I have to travel here to Istanbul, Turkey, to give a public lecture, to feel safe, actually, for the first time in a long time, giving a public lecture on Islamophobia. So in this inaugural session, I want to lay out the larger historical and political and cultural factors that have led us into this age of Islamophobia in which we now find ourselves in. And for the sake of time, I want to focus on three broad factors that have fueled Islamophobia in the past and that have put us in the predicament we find ourselves in today, particularly in Europe and the United States, where Muslims are minority populations. The three factors I will focus on are imperialism, ignorance, and what I would simply call the lack of insufficient relationships or the lack of interfaith relationships between Muslim minority populations and majority populations. Let me begin with imperialism in both the historical aspect and how it factors into the present. As we all know, Islam, when it came on the scene, quickly expanded in the 7th and 8th centuries to develop into a series of empires. And these empires quickly came into contact with and tension with European Christian kingdoms and empires. So in many ways, the initial contact between Islam and the West, if you will, involved a political rivalry. And that political rivalry is very important to try to help understand how we've gotten to where we are today. Now, for most of that history, Islamic empires had the upper hand. Politically, culturally, economically, Militarily, they were far more advanced than European Christian kingdoms and empires. Medieval Europe was the backwoods of that time, right? But it's not until we get into the late 18th century, into the 19th century, that political fortunes, at least, start to shift, and European empires are on the ascendancy in many of what we would think of today as the Muslim majority world, imposing some form of imperial or colonial rule on the vast majority of Muslim majority regions. And this is true in the 19th into the first half of the 20th century. Now, after the Second World War, as European empires, at least formally speaking, start to recede, we have two new superpowers emerge, the Soviet Union and the United States, which really was an imperial rivalry. This is an imperial context. And the Cold War, in many ways, was fought out ideologically, politically, sometimes even militarily, in Muslim majority regions, with the United States and the Soviet Union aligning themselves with various Muslim majority regions and governments and rulers in order to try to secure allies or to bolster themselves against enemies and also to secure energy resources. And when the Soviet Union collapses in the late 20th century, arguably speaking, you have one really remaining empire, and that is the United States going into the 21st century. In many ways, what happened on 9/11, the war on terror, must be understood in a U.S. imperial context and history. Now, what ties all of these imperial projects together is the need to construct the people you're trying to conquer as the other, to demonize and dehumanize them in order to galvanize popular support for the imperial project back at home. Moreover, in the context of Western imperialism, this dehumanization process was enabled and is enabled to this day by ideologies of racial superiority and white supremacy. You cannot understand imperialism apart from those ideologies that undergird them and fuel them. So there's a long history of Western empires constructing Muslims as the threatening, inferior, racialized, uncivilized, backwards, other. And in many ways, majority populations in the West have inherited these perceptions of Muslims. History matters. We have been hostile to Muslims as majority populations in the West because we have seen them as obstacles to our imperial ambitions. And to the extent that Muslim minority populations become symbolic stand-ins to those imperial obstacles abroad, we understand something about the Islamophobia that is so rampant in the West today. So that's the first factor I want to call attention to. The second factor is ignorance. So there's a paradox in the West. Many people in the majority populations of Europe and the United States harbor strong feelings about Islam, and yet know very little about Islam. Strong feelings about something they don't really know much about. And this too has a long history to it. Western European Christianity and Western European Christians, as they first came into contact with Muslims many centuries ago, initially thought of Muslims as pagans, just dismissed them as pagans, weren't particularly curious or interested in Islam as a religion. Now, when you get closer to the Crusades, this starts to change a bit, as European Christians come to believe of Muslims not as pagans, but as heretics, as people who understand something of what's in the Bible, the Christian scriptures, but they have misunderstood it and they have distorted it. They don't understand Jesus, for example. They don't understand the true Christian faith. So the lens changes, right? But the platform doesn't, by and large, to the extent that Islam is not understood on its own terms, or as how Muslims themselves would understand and interpret their own text and traditions, which is part of what I mean by ignorance and religious illiteracy. It's not just knowing stuff about another religion, it's how people of that religion interpret their own text and traditions. And this is true for much of European history. Even in the 16th century, someone like Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, who probably knew more about Islam than most of his contemporaries, still could not view Islam on its own terms or from the perspective of Muslims, and maybe it's anachronistic to think that he could have. When we get further into the modern era, particularly in the 19th and 20th century, we have the rise of Orientalism, and Orientalism starts to drive what a lot of Western elites, at least, understand about Islam. And to some extent, it was an improvement over the many centuries before in terms of knowledge about Islam. It's the cultures, the traditions, the customs, the languages, the religion of Muslim peoples. But as Edward Said famously noted, this knowledge was always intertwined with, if not distorted by, the Western imperial project, even for Orientalist scholars who may not have explicitly been trying to do that their work nonetheless fueled the Western imperial project. So the purpose of learning about Islam seemed to be connected to the desire and the drive to dominate the Muslim majority world. And that too prevented the West from taking Islam on its own terms, so ignorance continued to abound. Now today, in Europe and the United States, the academic study of Islam has improved significantly, in part thanks to Edward Said. But ignorance of Islam on the whole continues to abound. According to a Gallup poll from some years ago, 63% of Americans say that they have little to no knowledge of Islam. It's about 2/3 of Americans who admit that they know little to nothing about Islam. And I have my doubts about the other third. According to a YouGov poll and a Huffington Post poll from 2015, 55% of Americans admit to having unfavorable views of Islam. So two-thirds of the country admits it doesn't know much of anything about Islam, and yet a majority of the country still has negative views about Islam. And how do we explain that in the present? By and large, majority populations in the US and Europe have not engaged in any significant study of Islamic texts and traditions. Their knowledge of Islam often comes from one of two sources. The first is the media. The media which focuses mostly on stories that have to do with terrorism or violence, or sometimes the oppression of women, but which rarely provides you a larger glimpse into the lived religion of over 1.6 billion people. And we have media study after media study after media study that confirms this negative framing of Islam. A 2017 study from Georgia State University found terrorist attacks in which the perpetrator has a Muslim background receives 4.5 times the media coverage in the United States as attacks carried out by people who are not Muslim. Even though, in this particular study, individuals of the Muslim background were only responsible for just about 12% of those attacks. So about 12% of the attacks they're responsible for, but they received 4.5 times the media coverage. And that tells you something, right, about our skewed perception of Muslims and Islam. A 2015 study from a Toronto-based firm of the New York Times found that Islam and Muslims are portrayed more negatively in the New York Times than cancer and cocaine. Islam can't beat cancer and cocaine in the New York Times when it comes to positive coverage. It does make me wonder about all the positive stories about cocaine that the New York Times must have, but it definitely tells you something about what drives media coverage. So the media is one major source of knowledge about Islam in many Western nations, and you find comparable studies about the media in Europe as well. The other, and it's connected, is the professional Islamophobia industry, which is a network of far-right politicians, religious leaders, bloggers, writers, pseudo-scholars, pseudo-journalists who make a living and a career off of manufacturing anti-Muslim hatred for popular consumption. This industry, I should add, owes its very existence to the media, and the media amplifies its message and its narratives to mass audiences. We have seen this industry, which I would say a decade ago was still very much a fringe industry, go mainstream in the past decade, and this has gradually been happening, and it certainly was accelerated in the 2016 election cycle in the United States, where people like Robert Spencer and Frank Gaffney and Pamela Geller are no longer these fringe figures. They actually have the ears of people who are close to the president. In some cases, they have the ear of the president himself. And that has happened mostly in the context of the last 10 years. So these are the two sources of our knowledge of Islam from many in the majority population. A final note I want to make on this topic of ignorance and the perpetuation of ignorance before I move to my last point. The ignorance I'm referring to here is not only a question of a lack of information about Islam, the solution to which is simply to teach and educate majority populations about the truth of Islam. The truth is that there's actually plenty of great information out there about Islam. Plenty of great books, scholarship, Muslim leaders giving lectures, public lectures, going into the media to talk about Islam. It's not that you can't find good information about Islam in the United States or in Europe. And since 9/11, I can't tell you how many Muslim leaders and ordinary Muslims and religion scholars have been giving introduction to Islam talks for the public, or what I call Islam 101 talks. But we're past the point in which introductory lectures on Islam for the larger public can do much good in addressing this form of ignorance. This is not a case in which if someone who is prejudiced toward Islam or Muslims simply learns the 5 pillars of Islam, or they read the Quran a little bit more closely, that their prejudice is going to disappear. As I try to remind audiences I speak to in the United States, even Robert Spencer knows the 5 pillars of Islam. It doesn't make him less prejudiced. In many ways, it's what he uses as weapons in his war against Muslims. It's on this point that I think it's helpful to look back to Edward Said, and there's a small passage in his book Orientalism that I think is profound in terms of trying to get a hold of this notion that ignorance about Islam is simply about a lack of information. Edward Said writes, "One ought never to assume that the structure of Orientalism is nothing more than a structure of lies or of myths, which were the truth about them to be told would simply blow away." If I paraphrase that in terms of Islamophobia, we shouldn't assume that the structure of Islamophobia is simply built on lies and myths, that if the truth about Islam were to be told, Islamophobia would simply blow away. Said's point about Orientalism was that that's naive. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of how Orientalism perpetuates itself, the structural dimensions to it, the enabling power of the state, the imperial project which it fuels. This is long past the point of just telling truths about Islam or providing facts to the larger public. We must bear in mind that centuries of imperialism and racism, along with the recent media domination of the Islamic narrative and the Islamophobia industry, all of this has damaged the cognitive frameworks of the majority population that they use to download information about Islam. Majority populations, I would argue, are no longer epistemologically capable of hearing interpretations of Islam or factual information about Islam in a manner that could counteract widespread prejudice. If anything, our cognitive frameworks have been rewired to the point that any information many of us receive about Islam is actually turned against Muslims. Somehow we find a way to make it a source of prejudice about Muslims. Racism and imperialism are responsible for this rewiring, for the damage to these cognitive frameworks in the majority population, and until we repair that damage, no amount of introduction to Islam lectures is going to make a significant difference when it comes to challenging Islamophobia. So that's the caveat I want to make about this topic of ignorance. The final point I briefly want to touch on is the lack of relationships, insufficient relationships. The truth is there are not enough strong relationships in Western nations between Muslim minority populations and the non-Muslim majority. But personal relationships matter. They do. They break down barriers. They erode prejudices. They introduce a human face into the equation that's oftentimes lacking in the United States and in Europe, where Muslims are more abstractions to a lot of people. And for much of history, whatever relationships have existed between Muslims and non-Muslims oftentimes have existed in a context of political domination, back to my first point on imperialism. This is true both in Islamic empires and in European Christian kingdoms and empires and in the US empire. These have been in context in which people have been dominated, exploited, colonized. None of this enables healthy relationships to emerge, relationships of respect and mutuality and reciprocity. If we were to fast forward to today, we know from surveys that many in the West admit to having few, if any, substantial relationships with Muslims. And this opens up a gap for centuries-old prejudices and hostilities to continue to drive perceptions of Islam. According to a Huffington Post poll from 2015, 68% of those surveyed in the United States said that they had no friends who were Muslims. just over 2/3 of the population says, I don't have a personal friendship with someone who's a Muslim. And you can find comparable studies in Europe as well. But we also know from study after study after study that there is some kind of correlation between our knowledge of people of other traditions and our feelings and opinions about those traditions. If I know someone who's Muslim and I'm not Muslim myself, I'm much more likely to have a positive view of Islam. It actually works for any religion, all religions. In the social sciences, intergroup contact theory has been making this argument for decades, actually going back to the 1950s in the United States with race relations, in terms of having a relationship with someone of a different racial, ethnic, cultural, or religious group, and having more positive feelings and attitudes toward that group. Now, it's a larger question, how do you translate these individual friendships and relationships into larger movements that affect social and political change, and that's beyond what I can talk about this morning. But we do know that relationships are game changers. They make a difference when it comes to Islamophobia, and yet those relationships simply are not there in the United States and in Europe. So these three factors, imperialism, ignorance, insufficient relationships, or the lack of interfaith relationships, these demonstrate how the intersections of historical, cultural, and political factors in Europe and the US have given rise to Islamophobia and have fashioned its trajectory into the 21st century. And I think by shedding light on these factors, we are reminded that Islamophobia has shaped European and American identity not only for decades, but for centuries. And this means that 9/11 represents one new chapter in this history, not the beginning of it. The election of Donald Trump, another new chapter. The rise of the far right in Europe, yet another new chapter. But these are not the first chapters. And dare I say, will they be the last? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green, and keeping the time. I would like to open the floor for Dr. Mohammad Marandi from Tehran University. He's going to talk about the intellectual framework of Islamophobia.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers and Professor Al-Arian for inviting me to this wonderful city and university. And since Salman and Todd have both said a lot of very useful things, both yesterday and today, I've sort of changed my topic. I'm not going to be saying anything profound. I don't have that capability, but I'll try to make a few points that hopefully will be somewhat useful. I think I should begin with Islamophobia itself. It is a problematic term for a host of reasons. It's difficult to define, but also since phobia is a sort of an irrational fear or an extreme fear, it is a sort of medical term. So those who oppose the term Islamophobia say that this is used, it's a trope to prevent debate, it's a trope that impedes free speech, and Muslims use this to prevent legitimate critique. So it's careful not to overuse or misuse the term, because I think it is a legitimate term, but it is sometimes easy for us to misuse it when we become emotional, and therefore we become less convincing. I think that Islamophobia, and I'm just giving notes, there's a lot that I am not saying, so if I say something, it doesn't mean that I'm excluding other things, but I think Islamophobia increases when there is a perception of some sort of external threat or internal threat, and such as Russophobia that we see today. We see a resurgence of Russophobia, and I think that's because of the rising power of Russia, but also I think the relative decline in the West. So these two may be, Islamophobia and other phobias, there are all sorts of phobias. It's not just Muslims, it's different races, and we have our own phobias. It's not as if we are the innocent actors, but since the world that we live in is one where the West has hegemony, this, I think, is the priority, but also we have to be careful about sectarian, racial prejudices, and so on, which I'll touch upon at the end of my talk. So those, and also many of those who promote Islamophobia don't necessarily have a phobia themselves. This is politics. It's quite possible that Trump is not a racist. I'm not sure that he is a racist, but he is a person who's using the race card for his own benefits. In other words, he's very practical and immoral. He may be racist, but I don't have any personal evidence about that. But he is definitely using the race card. When he spoke that famous speech, when he spoke about Latinos and the rape, they're sending their rapists and so on and so forth to the United States. That's the equivalent of what we're discussing today when we're talking about Islamophobia. So it is difficult. There's no exact, I think, formula to describe Islamophobia. But when there is this growing fear, legitimate or illegitimate or otherwise, Muslims feel cornered. And I'm talking about both the Muslims in the West who are minorities or in non-Western countries that are minorities. Someone yesterday pointed that out correctly. Or those who live in Muslim majority countries, because you also feel cornered, because the power of the discourse is so great, it influences the way people in your own society view themselves. A sort of double consciousness emerges, where you look at yourself through the eyes of others. So you see yourself, and then you begin to, and I personally think that those who are most affected are actually the educated. The more educated you are, the more often, and this is anecdotal, there's nothing scientific about what I'm saying, but I think that since all of us, our education is basically Western, even when we study in Turkish or Farsi or Arabic or Mandarin, most of our textbooks, most of the books are translations of English. For people like us, it's English itself. So we are brought up with a sort of Western mentality. Even those of us who are claimed to be really anti-Western throughout high school, throughout university, they've, for the most part, been Western educated. And sometimes these people who are influenced and who feel that they begin to become apologetic, they too start scapegoating minorities or those who are Muslim or their fellow Muslims. So, and every time there's some sort of outrage, like 9/11, as a few have mentioned, or anything, Muslims, the communities feel more and more that they have to retreat. They have to go back, they become increasingly demoralized, and they become increasingly divided. So the Muslim communities themselves begin to fight among themselves increasingly. So whether it's banning minarets in Switzerland, or prohibiting or restricting hijab in Europe, whatever hijab may mean, different definitions. Many Muslims feel compelled that for the sake of the community, to accept these new intellectual and practical restrictions. So you're sort of voluntarily doing what the dominant narrative wants you to do. And not just for the community, but also for your own personal welfare. Integration is seen as the priority. So gradually we become exactly what they are, except we say, we can wear headscarves. So we often are proud that we behave like they do. We have, we have alcohol here too. Yes, we have women in bikinis. Don't worry, we're civilized, But, some of our people have headscarves. So we want to be exactly like them. And then, since more and more people of these, especially public figures, become moderates, you often have, unfortunately, others who within the community who feel increasingly isolated, and then some of them are pushed in the opposite direction. So when we talk about extremism or takfiri ideology and so on and so forth, you have these splits, I think. And again, one could argue that this analysis is not completely accurate, and of course I am caricaturing to a degree, I'm overgeneralizing to a degree, but I think there's at least a touch of reality in what I'm saying. So, and then we come into this sort of situation when we were talking yesterday, which should we be an attacker or a defender? And I think that's a very dangerous binary. That's a very problematic binary. I don't remember the name of the football player. I'm not, I don't know anything about football, so I don't even know the Iranian name. So in any case, to my shame. Anyway, so as I said, increasingly Muslim academics, intellectuals, scholars, whatever they mean, become apologetic. You know, Islam is the religion of peace and you know, all those things. I mean, not that it is the religion of war, but, you know, it's not as if they're pacifist Muslims. We know we sit there and no matter what happens and do nothing. But, you know, but they gradually begin to reinterpret Islam. Not based on some ijtihad that is based on texts and the needs of space, the time and era, but based upon the pressures that society imposes upon them. So we are told that Islam, similar to Christianity, needs reform, the Christianity of the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. So in a sense, Islam is backward. We're behind Christianity. We have to go through all the changes that Christianity went through because we're an inferior religion. That's implied. And Islam is stuck in the past, so we have to go through all the changes that Christianity went through, for good or for ill, in order to be relevant in today's world. And of course, these intellectuals, they gain status, and they gain funding at times, and there's an incentive to pursue that sort of narrative. While on the other hand, those who don't pursue the same line, they get isolated, they don't get tenures, and they're not in the public eye at all, or very rarely are they. And even those who do gain the status, if at times when something really bad happens, like in Gaza, they'll be moderate because they'll be concerned that they may lose that status, or they'll be seen as revealing their extremist streak that was hidden under, you know, the surface somewhere. So it's very difficult, therefore, to remain critical of these dominant narratives. And gradually peers move away. Again, I'm caricaturing. I'm over-exaggerating. But everything that I say here, there are elements of truth within it. But I'm not saying that anyone who's critical, they are sort of sitting at home and everyone ignores them. But it's very difficult. When you watch TV, when you look at the think tanks, when you look at the major, even academic outlets, it's very difficult for people like myself or Salman or others to publish at times, as we were discussing yesterday. So many of these public figures would continue to acknowledge that Western construction of knowledge is fraught with inadequacies, but they would never say that, and they would say, well, at least we have freedom in the West, sort of. So there is this hierarchy. So no matter what, they would never say that it's really these Western values, perhaps, or many of the Western values. I'm not trying to dismiss the West completely. I'm just saying, you know, I'm looking at this binary. They would never say that these values in the West are to blame. And even in Western countries, many who do critique them, they sort of say we're straying from our values. Rather, it's, you know, our values are there, but, you know, whenever there's something happens in Libya or wherever, or in Palestine, they say, yes, we strayed, or in Iraq, we strayed from our values. You know, so once Obama, I think when he was speaking about, I don't remember what it was, maybe it was Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay, he was saying, this is not who we are. Someone said that, I don't recall. But this is who you are. You cannot say that my action, when it comes to others, your actions reflect your essential existence, and when it's them, I say, no, that's not who we are. Then who is it? So those values are there, but they're sort of lost their way, as if they're in the forest and they have to find them and bring them back. But in the case of others, non-Western civilizations and peoples, that logic doesn't seem to work. So, as I've been speaking, I think, and as Todd was talking about earlier, we see that I'm really talking a lot about Orientalism. And the Islamophobia, therefore, I think, is linked to Orientalism and the stereotypes, which I won't go into because he described some of them again. But, we are sort of civilizational foils that justify colonialism and imperialism, and they diminish even the problems in the West, because when you have this hierarchy, when you have problems in your own society, at least have something else to look at to say, well, at least we're not them. So it reinforces your own position. And also, it justifies colonialism, because when the other is inferior, when they treat their women as animals, when they're barbaric, then they're less than us. So if we go in and take their resources and so on, it's in order to better them. They do not deserve it. They're childlike. They're not mature, and so on and so forth. So and this, just as I said, this justifies confiscation. And I think it was Sartre who said, when he spoke about a land without a people and a people without a land, or maybe it's the other way around. And he was speaking about Palestine, and that as if there was no one there, and it was like the ideal place for the Israeli people. Why? Because there were people in Palestine. But again, it sort of implies this unworthiness, that somehow they're not, sort of like the Indians that they used to say, or the Native Americans, that they didn't really own land. They never understood ownership. So therefore it was legitimate to take the land. So all of these narratives and tropes allow for many actions to take place. And then no matter how bad it gets, we still have our freedoms. Sometimes you see Muslims in the West, and they criticize, and they say, well, then what about your uncle? Well, yes, at least here we have our freedoms, as if, again, there's this hierarchy that is acceptable in a fact. So the notion of serious moral and ideological culpability in the West, the notion that Western values are not necessarily superior, is something very difficult to deal with, because the narrative, the discourse is so powerful that it influences the way many of us think. Most, if not most. And therefore, when there is this hierarchy, there are different standards, and because there are different levels of civilization. So the same act that I carry out is interpreted differently than when someone else carries out that act. When I go into Iraq, it's a mistake. But when someone else goes into, I don't know, some other country, it's aggression, it's immoral, it's barbaric. The same action is interpreted differently because the order of civilization, the order of the degree of being civilized is not the same. Was that a warning?
Oh, no. You still have time. Don't worry.
Okay, I'll finish.
No, you are scared. You have 5 more minutes. Go ahead.
I'm not one of those people who stand up to Islamophobia. I'll back down like all the others. Anyway, so this is a major problem, and questioning whether this imaginative geography called the West, because the West is not really something that's really out there. And is New Zealand and Australia the West? It's nowhere near the West. What is the West? It's sort of an imaginative geography, as they say. Dealing with this, questioning this, is something that's no simple task. And a number of very, and especially since so many of there are so many native informants or Orientals, as one, I think, Turkish academic coined this term. I'm not quite sure. Or as Jalal Ahmad, the Iranian critic, called Westruck, or Malcolm X, the house Negro, or the brown Sahib. They're termed differently by different figures. As they point out, there are many of them who are more adamant and more aggressive than even their Eurocentric Western counterparts when it comes to these debates and discussions. So this is another problem, that within the Muslim community, and I'm not only, as I said, I'm not talking about just Islam. You can see these phobias elsewhere. And I'm not saying, as I'm critiquing what happens in the West and these narratives, we have to also look at ourselves, as I said earlier, about our own phobias. Are we essentially different? Or do we do the same thing? Do we have our own racial slurs? Do we have our own sectarian slurs? Do we have our own prejudices? We have to look carefully. If your daughter wants to marry someone of a different race, of a different color, of a different sect, if the same thing happened in Europe, and someone rejected it, or someone was angry about it, or someone was abusive because of it, would we be any different or the same? So we have to take into consideration that, yeah, this is seriously, definitely a warning. One more time and I'm leaving. So whatever shortcomings exist, this is the problem. Whatever shortcomings exist, there is this belief that that Western ideals and standards are the key components to any legitimate moral compass. And therefore, we attempt to mimic it. And again, I'm not saying that the West doesn't have values, but I'm saying that we mimic them. We don't really critique them. And the only way to we have to come to a point where we begin to decolonize our minds. If we want to move beyond it, the ultimate colonization is the colonization of the mind. If we want to find ways forward to achieve a better future, it's not a negation of what other civilizations or communities or religions or peoples have, but it's rather to see what they've achieved and see their shortcomings, and through this process of intellectual inquiry, to find a better way, or to improve upon it, or to find, or to revive your own values. And only then, I think, can you come to personal satisfaction, and only then do I think a community could live at ease with itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marandi. Just 20 minutes, exactly timing. Now, our third speaker is Dr. Erdenir, and he's going to, I think, try to answer the question why Islamophobia is prevalent today. Dr. Erdenir.
Thank you. Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. I would like to thank ISU for this excellent organization, Professor Alarian for his kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. As a person, a bureaucrat working for Turkey's EU vocation for the last 22 years, and as a diplomat right now working in Brussels, my presentation will rather have a European perspective, I would say, on how things are unfolding in the continent. Well, we had two excellent presentations on the intellectual and historical background of Islamophobia, so I will rather try to touch upon the contemporary issues at play rather than going into the philosophical background of Islamophobia. So I will touch upon two issues right now on why Islamophobia is still strong in Europe, and then I'll try to make an analysis on how the European societies are reacting, the European structures, I would say, it's state and society, and then bring a humble recommendation. I know we will be discussing the recommendations tomorrow, but I will also touch upon my recommendation today. Well, first of all, migration. As an external factor, the European continent has become the main destination for irregular migration from Muslim countries which have been experiencing political turmoils and civil wars. It's a serious issue. In 2017, there were 250 million migrants all around the world. If it was a country, it would be the most populated fifth country or so in the world. So it has serious implications for the Muslim world and for the Western world as well. And we are experiencing the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War. Over 1 million people sought refuge in European Union in 2015. This was a five-fold increase from the year before. The political debate, political discussion in European Union countries have been very much, invaded by this whole migration debate. And in fact, the reaction of the EU countries or the European countries were from a migration control, border management, crisis control perspective rather than integration, accommodation of the newcomers. In fact, the European countries had made deals with neighboring countries, with Western Balkans and, for instance, with Turkey. We had a famous migration deal 2 years ago on the 18th of March. The deal was basically called a one-to-one deal. I'm not going to go into details, but it was about controlling the migration from Turkey to EU countries. And right now, Turkey is hosting around 4 million migrants, mostly from Syria. And as we are speaking right now, there are Afghani people moving to West. And only this week, there were more than 20,000 people, Afghanis, moving from Erzurum, from Ağrı, the east of the country, to West, trying to reach the European countries. So this is an ongoing debate, ongoing issue. And what is the implication, of course, on migration? It's not only affecting the newcomers, the situation of newcomers, but also the Muslims that have been living in the European Union countries for decades and more than decades. So it is really adding up to this whole integration issue, not making things easier. Well, the second issue is the rise of populism that I would like to touch upon. Well, populism is in fact has its roots in a reaction to neoliberal policies of 1980s, which abandoned the people for the sake of markets, shifted policies from labor to capital. So it has a very economic background, in fact. And especially after the 2008 debt crisis in European Union countries, which triggered unemployment, high level of unemployment rates in European countries, populism had really found a fertile ground to grow up. And it was not only, of course, on liberal policies, neoliberal policies, but it included European Union, anti-EU, anti-liberalism, anti-Muslim, anti-migrant. So the debate was a complex, complicated one. Well, as you might know, in some countries, the right-wing parties have been a part of the government. For instance, in Finland, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, and Switzerland. But more than that, in major countries, major European countries, parties like UKIP, the Front National in France, they're changing their name, I guess, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the Austrian Freedom Party, and Dutch Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, they're enjoying record popularity. And as you might know, Brexit in the United Kingdom and Donald Trump's victory in the US is in fact an outcome of this populist policies. What is the implication, of course, on Muslims? Well, first of all, it's really shaking the foundation of democracies in the Western world. And shaking the foundation of democracies mean the minority rights are at stake, which has very close connection to the situation of Muslims in Western world, in European countries. Secondly, the center is shifting. The center parties are also becoming a part of this whole new discourse. They are somehow owning, showing ownership for that discourse as well, because there's a fight for votes. And as popularity increases, even the liberals, the social democrats, and the other camps are going into this discourse, owning it. And thirdly, among those others that have been hit by this new populism, the European Union, liberals, Jews, gays, Muslims. I think the weakest link is the Muslims, because they're not organized well. They don't have the the establishment that they should have done in years. So I think unfortunately they are the weakest link. Well, in this background, what is the situation of the European societies, the structures, how they are reacting to this new kind of political and social-cultural context? I would say I would try to touch upon three issues, the three pillars, I would say, of the European system or European societies: identity, security, and economy. Firstly, security. The terrorist attacks, especially after 9/11, the war on terror and the threat of radicalization, and then those terrorist bombings in major European cities have not helped this whole debate on Muslim integration. So the debate has shifted to a debate of securitization and criminalization policies, and with the introduction of new border policies and counter-terrorism and counter-radicalization measures in the member states, ethnic profiling and discriminatory policing of migrants have become widespread, unfortunately. So the Europeans really perceived this whole new threat thing as a security threat for themselves. The Muslim migrants coming to the European Union countries was perceived as a threat after all. And interestingly, the terrorist attacks in Europe were perpetrated by homegrown terrorists and by the returned foreign fighters. So that was, in fact, an interesting, issue to be underlined. Well, on economy, instead of designing integration policies, which required, of course, serious funding on education, training, access to labor market, and social and health services, again, overlooked by short-term policies, unfortunately. And the motto in many European countries or Western countries, it was first their own priorities, America first, or in Northern League, Italians first motto had shown that first of all, it was their own issues to be undertaken. So there were no resources, in fact, allocated for the integration of Muslims. And when we look through, for instance, the Turkey-EU deal, what the Europeans had asked for the migrants that we were, sending to European countries, they were looking for qualified people with university degrees, for instance. So there was a cost-benefit analysis from the European side. So, generally speaking, Europeans do not want to share resources. This is a fact. And just to give a simple example, last month a food bank in Germany, in Essen, decided to give food only to Germans. This is interesting because it's just a local initiative, and a local initiative decides not to give food to foreigners because on the grounds that the elder Germans could not get food because of the young migrant men who are more active, or more active in the line, getting in front of the line. So, but it shows that there's no space for tolerance, or no way of sharing the resources with the outsiders or the migrants coming. Well, the faltering economy has also had a negative impact on the integration of migrants into the labor market. Just to give a population projection, according to estimates, a loss of more than 20 million people in the EU labor supply between 2023 and 2050. So the aging European populations, in fact, need people who are qualified and who can really, contribute to European economies. But the thing is that the European perspective is quite short-term, without any designing long-term policies, unfortunately. And identity, of course, it's, I think, the core of this whole debate on how the governments are perceiving this whole new migration picture. Some governments even openly stated that while they're prepared to receive refugees, they would only accept Christians, not Muslims. So even at that point of receiving migrants, the identity issue had come to fore. Well, on the value issue, I know it's a very complicated issue. Our speakers had made comments on how Islamophobia is unfolding. On the value issue, I guess we should be focusing on the situation of Muslims rather than Islam itself, and this was in fact brought up yesterday as well, because when we look to the societies in Europe, European societies, they have become post-Christian societies, and religion is not so much in play anymore. So when they see that Islam as a foreign religion, or even if it's established, is accepted as a religion, like in Belgium or in some other European countries, the concept, the notion of that religion is back is not very much appreciated. But secondly, the exclusion is not from a religious perspective. I mean, as Dr. Green had mentioned, there is ignorance on Islam. Nobody is debating on the pillars of Islam or Sunnah or Fiqh, but the debate is on the lifestyles, the culture, the dietary requirement, or the dress codes of people of Muslims, and that is the the external markers that are causing that discrimination. So, in fact, we had worked on this concept. I also have an article on it. I think Islamophobia could be a better discrimination of the situation of this new racism, which targets cultures, lifestyles, and physical appearances. Well, on the identity issue, I also would like to touch upon the position of the European Union, because the European Union is said to be established on values, because it's, okay, there was an economic integration, a single market, but the very foundation is the values that it was built on. Unfortunately, the EU has been on this whole migrant issue, migration issue, and the integration issue has been more about talk than deeds. There have been some initiatives, for instance, the Blue Card Directive or the agenda on European agenda on migration. But it's EU is good on legislation, but not in implementation, unfortunately. And also, I mean, the member states themselves are shifting from European values. The United Kingdom is leaving. Brexit is happening. Many countries that have joined the European Union in 2004, 2007, Najm cycle, are in a de-Europeanization process, what we would be calling, leaving those values. So I think values are becoming, unfortunately, irrelevant for the European Union. I hope this meeting is off the record, by the way. And from the Muslim perspective, the European Union is a white Christian club still. I mean, it still couldn't prove itself that it was based on values. I think the adventure, Turkey's EU adventure has not helped as well. I mean, for more than 50 years, there is a big debate on how Turkey would be integrated, and Turkey has been excluded on the basis of some arguments, too big, too poor, and too Muslim was a part of it. So being Muslim had always been a part of this whole process, not on texts, not on formal negotiations, but at the background. So I would also like to make that point as well. Well, as a recommendation, how to tackle Islamophobia, well, we should really have the facts in hand properly, I guess, because the European societies have reached their limits. This is a fact. Like it or not, we can criticize Western values, we can criticize Westernization, but all those migrant peoples, millions of people, are trying to move the Western world, European countries, rather than the Islamic countries. This is another fact. But there's another fact that these countries are at their limits, and they don't want to integrate more. I mean, their policies of receiving the people is of exclusion or assimilation, not of integration. So, you know, this is a very, controversial issue, I guess, how to look into the future. So we have to keep this in mind. I don't know how, this is a, debate. This should be a debate for the Organization for Islamic Conference, for the countries of Islamic Conference as well. I'm not very hopeful about it, but the countries of the Muslim world should take care of the issue of the migrant populations, I guess. It's very important. We have a saying in Turkey, it says, one should cut its own umbilical cord. Umbilical cord is when a baby is born, it's the cord between the mother and the baby. So the baby, if he wants or she wants to, survive, perhaps needs to cut it himself. So this is literally meaning you should take control of issues on your own. And so I guess as a recommendation, the Muslims should really, take care of issues. I know the striker metaphor was not very much welcome. It's not about being offensive, but it's about being active. I very much resemble the situation of Muslims to the situation of the Jews a century ago. I'm wrapping up. I mean, not so far away, 100 years ago, a century ago, in the United States and Europe, Jews were faced with persecution, with discrimination and violence. They faced a very tragic, Holocaust in the 1940s. But they survived, and they survived with their intellectual capacity building, with their networking, with their lobbying. So I guess there's room for improvement for us, and we should really work on. Otherwise, we will struggle with all of our issues in the Muslim world, from the migrant issue to the Palestine issue. So at the end of the day, this is a power game, power exercise. Thank you very much.
Sorry. I would like to thank all speakers. Actually, as I mentioned, as it was mentioned in the introduction, I'm mainly working on EU affairs, teaching and researching on EU-related politics and ideas. And Islamophobia came to my agenda dealing with these rise of immigration and in Turkey relations context in the meaning of Islamophobia. And I think I learned a lot today. I don't know how the audience felt, but I don't know, especially Dr. Erdenir's and Dr. Green's presentation. I felt like a little bit pessimistic picture about dealing and tackling with Islamophobia. I might be wrong, but we are going to open the floor for questions. I would like to first briefly ask some questions, then give 2, 3, or maybe 5 minutes per person, then I will open the floor for discussion for your questions. I would like to ask Dr. Green about, you talked about the dominant narrative about Islamophobia in the United States. I wonder whether this travel ban on Muslims, whether was there an opportunity during this debate about to challenge the ideas about Islamophobia in the United States? Because what we see in the media and the pictures, there were also so many people who were resisting the Trump's policy on Muslim men. And my second question is, what is the role of social media in promoting or confronting Islamophobia in the United States and globally, actually? Because you talked about the role of media and ignorance. The social media is contributing to it, or whether it is an effective tool to fight with Islamophobia. Dr. Marandi, thank you for a very good presentation, and you touched upon, I think, some important issues, and maybe you didn't have an opportunity to go into detail. I really wonder what you would like to say more about this mimicking the others or self-critiquing about our visions about this Islamophobia issue. And when I look at the debates, I see that mainly we are focusing on, obviously, rightly, Western imperialism and Western attitudes on Islamophobia. And when we see reports about Islamophobia in Europe, Islamophobia in the United States. But is it more, or do we have to accept it it's like a Western problem, it's happening only in the West, or we should tackle it as a global problem? Islamophobia in Russia, Islamophobia in China, and sometimes Islamophobia in even Muslim-dominated countries. Would you like to, I would like to comment on this as well. And Dr. Erdenir, thank you for excellent presentation with insights also coming from the field, knowing about all the debates between Turkish and European political actors. I would like to hear your opinion. Again, I hope it is off the record, whether Turkey-EU relations increasing the debate about or increasing Islamophobia in Europe, or really it's like an antidote to Islamophobia, because this is one of the main arguments of Turkish political authorities or intellectuals, that Turkey will be an antidote to clash of civilizations or this kind of debate. Can we see a counter effect in Turkey relations? And maybe a general questions related with the all presentations, or maybe the following presentations. I sometimes have kind of a worry that when we are discussing the issue of Islamophobia, also Dr. Marandi touched upon this, we should tackle with this problem, we should deal with this problem, we should underline the structural problems, but at the end I think we should also be careful about don't fall into trap of being anti-Western and anti-Christian and all anti-other things that we have been criticizing in the West, about ignorance about Islam, about ignorance about the West, ignorance about European Union, ignorance about Christianity. We also touch upon these issues when we are fighting against, dealing with, or I don't want to use the word fight, maybe Islamophobia issue. First Dr. Green, then Dr. Marandi, then Dr. Erdenir, 5 minutes per person, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the other wonderful presentations this morning. So the first question, could I find a silver lining in any of the developments in terms of the rise of Islamophobia in the United States and challenging certain manifestations of Islamophobia, particularly, for example, the Muslim ban or the various versions of the Muslim ban that President Trump has tried to put forth? On the one hand, yes, opportunities have arisen in the United States since the election of Donald Trump for larger movements to push back against overt Islamophobia, state-sponsored Islamophobia, the instrumentalizing of Islamophobia that took place during Trump's campaign and now is taking place during his presidency, the protesting at airports from the first ban, if you remember the news cycle then, was a great example of larger movements of people around the country in the United States showing up physically, which I think is important, embodying their protest, standing up against that ban. My concern, of course, is that since those protests died down after the first ban, we've had multiple versions of the Trump ban. It's hard to even keep count of whether we're on 3.0 or 2.5 or something along those lines, but the Trump administration has been persistent on the Muslim ban. In fact, it's been one of its most persistent policies since the beginning, because the first Muslim ban took place pretty soon after he took office. And yet we haven't seen the same kind of energy in terms of responding to subsequent versions of the Muslim ban, in part because the president, I think, has actually been pretty nimble on this, or trying to also circumvent legal challenges to the ban as well. So there's still a lot of frustration, I think, when it comes to how do we mobilize against the president. I will say this, and I don't mean to be overly pessimistic, but there's a reason that this ban is such a priority for the president, I think, as a lot of his other statements and policy suggestions during this campaign. Instrumentalizing Islamophobia works. I think Mohammad and I were having this conversation yesterday that I'm not one of those people who thinks President Trump is dumb. I think he has a certain kind of intelligence. Maybe not an intellectual, but he has a certain kind of intelligence in terms of knowing what drives people in terms of fear, how to tap into that fear, how to galvanize it, mobilize it, channel it for political gain. And those of us on the other side, I think, have been 2 steps behind him the whole time. We underestimated him from the very beginning, and so we're playing catch-up. I do believe there's opportunity to still mobilize and push back against the president, but we're behind. And we've got to find a way to tap into that energy from the first set of protests from the Muslim ban and keep it going, and maybe the midterm elections, which will come up this year, might be an opportunity for that. In terms of social media, I think social media should be thought of as a public health concern. I think the media should be thought of as a public health concern. How we consume social media, how we consume mass media, even though we might categorize these as 2 different forms of media for some understandable reasons. But in fact, it is our consumption of this that is very unhealthy. And on average, social media has made the problem of Islamophobia far worse. Certainly there are people like me. I don't think I fully understand Twitter, but I still try to use it, or Facebook, or other social media platforms. But the Islamophobia industry and those on that side are much savvier at the use of social media. They're much more prolific. They have a lot of money to fuel it and fund it. You know, I have a day job. I teach students, I write, I do things like this, and all sorts of other things. Robert Spencer, all the man does is put out content on Jihad Watch, and then he tweets it and puts it on Facebook, and he knows how to do it. He knows SEO, or search engine optimization. These are people who know what they're doing, that we also have underestimated. And now they have found their way into Washington, into the Washington establishment. So social media can be an opportunity to push back on Islamophobia as well, but we lack the funding, we lack the networking. I think we lack the resolve sometimes on the other side to actually challenge people like Spencer and Geller. And in order to really be effective on this, we'll have to improve on all of those areas. But as for now, social media is a great danger, I think, to Muslim minority communities, to many others in the United States, in terms of who's wielding it most effectively.
Well, first I'd like to touch upon the so-called Muslim ban. This didn't begin with Donald Trump. The first steps were taken under the Obama administration. And this was legislation that Obama signed, carrying out visa restrictions for these very same countries. The very same countries that later came out in the presidential decree. There were already restrictions put in place through Congress and the Senate, and it was not there were no party divisions. Democrats and Republicans together supported it, and President Obama didn't refrain from signing it. With regards to this sort of mimicking that I was speaking about, it manifests itself in different ways, and there's a lot to talk about. And there are people here better than I who could do that. But I'd like to give an example. When the conquistadors first entered the Americas, in their logs, they described the natives, and though darker skinned and much darker, significantly darker, even though they were mostly from Southern Europe, the conquistadors, they described them at least as physically attractive. And on the other hand, there is a bit of, because the Aztec tribe was completely destroyed and there was no written language, very little remains, but there is some evidence that the natives did not like them physically. They consider them to be pale and unattractive. And I'm not saying that the Europeans are more or less attractive. That's not the point. The point is that when these 2 cultures first clashed or came face to face, there was not this hierarchy of aesthetic appeal, where white is superior. But when domination took place, when one people became subordinate, gradually this notion of inferiority and superiority manifested itself in different ways. And so therefore people of color were seen as inferior, and gradually this was internalized. So even among themselves, for example, in the United States, the slaves who were of lighter skin, and many of them were of lighter skin because their mothers were raped. The master would rape the slaves, like the third president of the United States, Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, who he kept slaves and he had children through them. He effectively raped them, but that's not how the narrative works in the United States. But in any case, having a lighter skin was something of greater value. And there's a novel by Toni Morrison that sort of discusses this, but I don't want to get into that. But you can imagine that this is not just simply something that stops at facial features. It also goes on. Then those people, you can understand how they could see themselves as intellectually inferior. And so, for example, if I want to write an article, I would often, or many colleagues would often use Western academics in their footnotes. If I want to speak about figures, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't use Islamic scholars, and some do, by the way, but it's sort of nativists. Sometimes we go to the other extreme. But for example, I would speak about Western. If I want to show my students or hear that that I'm knowledgeable, I would speak of Heidegger or Nietzsche. But if I was to say Mullah Sadra, then people say, "Oh my God, where's this guy? He's one of them." So this is a problem. And then we mimic. As I said, liberal economics, liberalism. For example, right now in the West, the sexualization or the commoditization of women, which now we see this Me Too hashtag, and so there's a problem in that society. But we don't think about alternative ways forward. Some do, and then it's on the other extreme, or liberal economics. We think it's the problem. We don't have a proper economic model, and we have to have one. It's not charity. We think that, yes, we're Muslims, so maybe we'll give more, homs or zakat, or we'll give to the poor. But we're basically mimicking everything. We're mimicking, and much of the problems that we have in the Islamic world, which is one of the reasons why people are leaving the Islamic world, is of course colonization, it is largely the West's fault that all this destruction is happening. Not that it's not our fault at all, but they are very more to blame than anyone else, in my opinion, historically speaking, definitely. But we don't have in the West, which has accumulated this wealth for hundreds of years, for right and wrong reasons, colonialism, but also, success and economy. We see now that liberalism is failing. We see liberal economics is failing. The gap between the rich and poor is widening. And then we, in countries that have not had hundreds of years of accumulating this wealth, we want to mimic this failed model. And since we don't have a strong and powerful middle class already, which in the West is declining, and the middle class is collapsing, we want to follow a model that when we do not have what they had tens of years ago. So basically, because we're not willing to think outside the box, and that doesn't mean a negation of everything that exists and that we want to be nativists and we want to just to hell with the West and they're all evil and we want something else. That's a really terrible way forward. But to think and find solutions to the problems that exist that may not at the moment exist in the broader Western intellectual narrative is, I think, very important for us. I think it's as I touched upon earlier, I think this is a global problem, but it's not just Islamophobia. Our own chauvinisms. Whether it's tribal, communal, religious, sectarian, racial, it's something that exists everywhere. And as I said, if my son or if my daughter, if I, when we say, how racist so and so in this country they are, or that country, are we any different? Hopefully we're not, but I'm not so sure.
Thank you. On the day when Turkey's negotiations with the European Union was announced back in 2004, there were more than 100 journalists from Muslim countries following the very, announcement. So there's a big interest from the Muslim world on how Turkey is doing with the European Union. It's not because they love Turkey, because it's more about how the Western world and the Islamic world would get along together. I think that's a very important issue. Otherwise, in none of our negotiations with the European Union, we have 35 chapters, or in none of the texts, religion is pronounced, as you very well know. After 9/11, this big debate on clash of civilizations by Huntington, it really was presented as an antidote, and we were really optimistic. And just after that, after 2001, we had opened the negotiations. It was a good timing, but there's always a resistance. And our first agreement with the European Union back in 1963, and then the opening of the negotiations, there always have been presented as a mistake by many circles in the European Union countries, saying that it was a mistake with getting so close with a country so different. Well, that difference is definitely on cultural values, which they claim, on the identity issues. I was wondering if the members of the European Parliament were here for the last 2 days, listening to this discussion, they would get lost here, I mean, because the things that we are discussing are so far away from them, from their realities, from the Brussels bubble. They have their own priorities, their own issues. So I think that's the role of Turkey, to make that link, that connection. That's I think, very important in making that connection, and I think Turkey has that role to bring the issues. If Turkey will become a member of the European Union one day, I'm still optimistic, because I'm at the defense line at the last man, so I still have that hope. It will really help the situation of Muslim migrants, which I've been speaking through my presentation. Muslim minorities, Muslim migrants, their situation in the European Union countries, because they're going to stay there. They're not moving, and more are coming. So we have to deal with it. We have to find solutions for their issues, and Turkey has a role on that issue. And finally, on the value debate, it's always a question if Turkish democracy, Turkish culture, of course, implying to the Muslim world as well, is compatible with Western values. No, it's not compatible with Western values, but it's compatible with universal values, because those are universal values that we are complying with. We are complying with them because they are universal, not that because they are Western. So I think that's the point to be made. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you again for excellent speeches and answers. Now I think we have around 20-25 minutes, I hope. Maybe I can push it to 30. Maybe we will try, depending on the questions and answers. Now I'm opening the floor. Anybody would like to ask questions to our speakers? Let's start from here. Then second question will be there. We will be happy if you can introduce yourselves.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Açık mı? Can you check?
Make some comments on Islamophobia. I guess we have to take this phenomena equally with the phenomena of the fast rise of Islam in Europe and in the United States, not compared to any other religion. And from their side, the Western side, I guess there's justifiable to try to launch this campaign in self-defense. And the effective defense is to launch an offense, to be offensive. The roots of this phenomena is known to all of us since the beginning of early Islam. Was other religions never accepted Islam, spearheaded fight against Islam during the presence of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it continued, and it is still continuing. According to our Quran, this fight will be eternal. I come to another point. America is different from Europe. Europe more knowledgeable about Islam than United States. And it has got a very important interactions with Muslims during the Ottoman Empire and during the Crusades. And the Ottoman Empire set a very, in spite of what we take against the Ottoman Empire, but they really set a good model for an empire which tolerates other religions and does not indulge itself in internal affairs of managing the minority. But Europe thoroughly knows this. And the Crusades, under the banner of spreading Christianity, they did a lot of damage, and they have got a lot of colonial motivation, as we all know. But the fact remains that Europe, since that time, this, and I don't like to generalize, say the knowledgeable people, and I have to say it, youth circles, in particular, knows the threat of Islam on other religions and on the West. That's why they did their best to try to keep Islam within certain circles of the Orientalists. They did some good, but they did a lot of damage because they never allowed. We were in the 60s in Europe. Islam is kept imprisoned in certain, just like a museum. When the test came to Germany, because they needed some labor, the Germans and the West, Europeans in particular, found no way except to have them, but they really projected a real assault to the social fabric and to the cultural aspects of Germany. Islam at that time in the 60s were projected in libraries of books of the Qadianis and Ismailis, and we used to pray in Qadiani and Ismaili mosque, no Sunnah institutions. And due to the privileged Muslims found in the West, especially liberties, right to worship the way, they have to swallow Muslims, especially sizable groups of Turks from here. That was a real shock. We were there. And then after that, series of religious institutions have been established. I'd like to go further. Libraries in the Western universities, all, you never find classical, proper Islam, Quran, no. All books of deviated religious communities. To the extent that a mayor of Cardiff in UK municipality adopted Islam. When he came to Jeddah to make Umrah, I have met him and have donated him some books, Quran translated, Yusuf Ali. We were frequent visitors to UK. And then I found him when I came as a tourist or a visitor to UK. And he had me lunch in Cardiff, in the municipality. I was curious to see where my books were, the Qurans. He was very much embarrassed. because it was in the storage. Not only this. I came to know that was in the 60s, that all Islamic centers which teaches Islam in UK, all except Edinburgh, teaches Islam as a cultural phenomenon. Only.
I don't want to interrupt you,
This is the
but
situation. I would like just to make some points.
Okay.
In what to do. What do we need first? When we're in the West, we don't regard ourselves as true Muslims. We behave like any Westerners. Most of us don't like that. Number one, now good numbers of intellectuals are in Western and United States universities. They came to know that they have an identity and they have a mission. Second, we need to, this is our weak points, to awaken the Muslims in Muslim areas to try to, because there is a lot of media advancements which we have to use. Second, Europe and United States in particular is open for universities to have comparative studies, inter-religious organizations, and this is our responsibility. Now we say this is Islamophobia is not something which is, we benefit from it. It gave us an opportunity that after
to talk about Islam.
11 September, the 11 September triggered all to
Debates.
know what is this Islam. We have to take this opportunity and to do our best to present proper Islam to the West, which is more
Hungry for information.
more able to accept and to propagate and to respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments and recommendations. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
I'm Ahmed. I'm a student of Ibn Khaldun University in master's program. So my question is to Professor Marandi. As you pointed out that phobia might not be an exclusive phenomenon of Western society against Muslim. And it's true that with the rise of Islamophobia in the West, we also see the rise of Westphobia or anti-Western attitude in Muslim societies. So it seems to me that there needs a dialogue between these two societies, or mutual understanding is needed. But if we look at the global structure, global power structure, or international order, we see that there is an inherent biasness, inherent unjust attitude or injustice that is quite completely pro-Western hegemony. So with the existence of this global order or unjust international order, is it ever possible to create or to construct a constructive dialogue or mutual understanding among these two cultures? So this is my question.
Okay. Dr. Taşgetiren.
My name is Ömer. I have a question to Dr. Erdenir and Dr. Green. Dr. Erdenir said Europe is a post-Christian, whereas Dr. Green talked about interfaith dialogue in the United States. So I am wondering whether you think different strategies should follow to deal with the Islamophobia in these different contexts, because depending on your audience, trying to reach out to let's say liberal, secular is different than trying to reach out to a Christian, a conservative Christian. So I just want to ask, do they think there are different Islamophobias in a sense? If there's a secular Islamophobia, the response to that should be different than a Christian Islamophobia or different, these kind of things. So that's it. Thank you.
Let me take one more question, and then, yes, one female participant.
My question is directed to Dr. Green. I really liked your point about rewiring cognitive frameworks. So I wanted to ask you if you found the idea of a strategic response to this issue in terms of humanizing the Muslim image, as was undertaken by the organized Jewish community several decades ago. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, Yahya, last question, then I will open the floor for answers.
Thank you. My question will be to Mr. Todd Green. Do you think that the Jewish lobby in the USA is playing a big role in promoting Islamophobia or not?
Israeli policies, challenging Israeli settlements, challenging Israeli soldiers who opened fire on Palestinian protesters, as they did last week. That itself gets categorized in a certain way as being anti-Semitic, which itself has an Islamophobic tinge to it, in my opinion. So yeah, there is a role there. I'm always cautious about differentiating some of the political aspects of this pro-Zionist organized movement and not necessarily referring to it broadly speaking as Jewish, because maybe it's because of my experience in the United States of collaborating and partnering with Jews in America who also have been trying to challenge Islamophobia as well. But on the political level, yes, I think there's something to that. On the question of the strategic responses to this idea of cognitive frameworks, and this is a point I made earlier in my talk about we're past the point where just one more introduction to Islam talk is going to make a difference on Islamophobia, right? That the problem no longer is just that the majority populations of the United States or Europe don't know enough about Islam, and if they just memorized more data, downloaded more data, it'd be done. If that were the case, we wouldn't be here, right? Because that's not the kind of problem we're dealing with. But if the majority populations are having problems downloading and absorbing and digesting facts, if you will, about Muslims or about Islam, how do you respond to that? How do you repair those frameworks? And to me, it's a long-term solution. I think of this kind of education in which you can have a majority population be more receptive to different perspectives of Islam, to how Muslims understand their own religion and live out their own religion, has to come through, again, the building of relationships, which is the last point I made in my talk, but it's also something I know as a teacher. As a classroom teacher, as a college professor, I know that the best education, the most transformative learning moments on any topic take place not when I show up cold into an audience I don't know and give some outstanding lecture. It happens when I build relationships with students and I mentor them. And in that mentoring relationship, there are ways of challenging people's preconceived notions about Islam or whatever that can take place in the way that I can't do if I travel around the United States, just giving Introduction to Islam 101 talks, right? So the relationship matters. Any kind of transformative education, in this case about Islam, requires relationships which are not there. The people who are doing that kind of work in the United States that I really admire, who do give Introduction to Islam 101 talks still, are the people who also are rooted in that community. And they're there for years and they work on building the relationships. And that's what I think will make the difference. That's what will rewire the cognitive frameworks in a way that I think will make people more receptive. But the bad news is that takes a long time. The good news is I'm pretty confident that that's the way to go. That's the way that it will work. That's how we can make a difference in that regard. On the different Islamophobias in Europe and the United States, yeah, there are differences in how we think about this from an interfaith perspective would change that, in part because, we can talk perhaps about a post-Christian Europe, or whether secularism is much more a prominent identity, at least in parts of Western Europe. There are other differences, I think, particularly the way European governments regulate religion and public expressions of religiosity. It's very different than the United States. So bans on hijab in public schools, bans on minarets. This would be hard to pull off in the United States. Not because there aren't some folks in the United States who wouldn't want to do it, but because of the history of how the government has related to religious communities and has been a bit more hands-off in terms of regulating public expressions of religiosity. Not completely, but more so than in European governments. When I take American students to Europe to study Islam in Europe, I mean, it's not just about Islam that they're surprised. They're surprised about the nature of church-state relations in Europe, which is very different compared to the United States in terms of this involvement in the religious affairs of a community, or France trying to define a French version of Islam. That'd be kind of a foreign concept in the United States. So there are those differences. Does that mean interfaith engagement and responses to Islamophobia is only an American thing or American suggestion? I don't know if I would go that far. I do think an interfaith response is key to combating Islamophobia in Europe. I think Islamophobia, whatever else it is an interfaith problem in the United States that requires an interfaith solution. And until you mobilize the Christian majority of the United States to respond to Islamophobia, either to change the way that they engage Muslim communities now in a negative sense, or those communities that just haven't engaged Muslims at all, and not to be complicit in state-sponsored Islamophobia by simply being silent. Until we change that, I don't see significant changes taking place in the United States. If you do not mobilize the Christian majority, the needle will not move on Islamophobia in the United States. Is that as true in Europe? Maybe not, because of the other factors that have been addressed here. But I still have this notion of churches in Europe, particularly the older established churches, as still having a role to play in all of this. If for any other reason, to think of these communities as the moral conscience of Europe, and that they have a role to play as a moral interlocutor on questions of how we treat our neighbors, in this case, how we treat our Muslim neighbors. And so the Church of England, Catholic Church of Spain, Church of Sweden, I do think they have a role. I do think there's a place for interfaith engagement and responses to Islamophobia in Europe that could be effective, even if, in terms of the political capital, European Christians may not have quite as much of that as American Christians do. American Christians actually have a lot of political capital. That's why we have to mobilize that segment of the population.
Well, on the different forms of Islamophobia in Europe versus United States, I would say yes, post-Christian societies, and the opposition the Muslims are facing are more from the secular liberal camp, I would say. For instance, in Belgium, right now, the ban on halal meat or the ban on hijab is from the secular liberal camp. And it's still an ongoing debate. And studies indicate that as the level of religiosity increases, the discrimination or prejudice against Muslims decrease in Europe. So interfaith dialogue is, I think, stronger or easier or whatever you call it, and resilient in Europe than the dialogue between the secular liberal camp versus the Muslims. Thank you.
A number of things. One is that part of the problem in response to your question, I really don't have a response. It's a very difficult thing to deal with, and I think it deserves its own conference, and a really specialized conference. But I think part of the problem, again, Salman yesterday touched upon it when he mentioned nationalism, for example. In the South, this North-South relationship, one of our problems is that we have mimicked European thought through the rise of nationalism. And the same is true with sect and religion and tribe and so on and so forth, which divides peoples. And through this divide, you cannot, as a result of this divide, we cannot form coalitions for resistance. And so when I, for example, when we have a seminar at a university in a Muslim country, how many people are we going to invite from Europe or the United States? How many people would we invite from Brazil, from neighboring Muslim countries, from India, so we ourselves are Eurocentric in our connections. And it is difficult, and that doesn't mean we should ignore Europe, but I'm saying that we have to change our own mentality in order to begin a real resistance. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It exists in the United States as well. And by the way, there was something, we should be very careful about the word Jewish, because Professor Al-Aryan, I think, knows better than I, that some of the most profoundly anti-Zionist activists in the United States are Jews and Christians. Some very heroic people. Some people have lost their jobs as professors. For example, Hilary Mann Leverett, who is a good friend, a family friend of ours, because of their positions.
Frankenstein.
Norman Fickle, yes. So, and then I would also like to point something out about, and even a part of the problem in the Islamic world when this extremism and so on. Just recently, Mohammed bin Salman admitted that, Wahhabism is, and the extremism, that it was a Cold War phenomenon, what their own allies called upon, Western countries called upon them to promote this. But we're not even able to project this knowledge outside, even in our own communities. So we have a problem with communication, and that's where people like you come in, because actually your generation is much better educated, not necessarily better educated, but more globally connected than my generation. So while I'm very skeptical about Facebook, Twitter, and we see how Google and all these entities are becoming more and more restricted and so on, but there are new ways of getting across boundaries. One thing I would like to intervene on two small issues that were not put to me. And one is this post-religious. The problem, in my opinion, is that in the West we have this flexible positional superiority. So the person may not be Christian, he may not be Jewish, but since he sees his tradition, his civilization as superior, he may be an atheist, but he would still consider to be Christianity that he doesn't believe in to be, hierarchically speaking, higher than Islam. So Islam still has to reform to become relevant, even though he doesn't believe in anything. Someone may believe in some. So, for example, in the past, in the 19th century, and I don't want to insult people here, but this is a fact, in the West, in literature, it was believed that Turks had a homosexual tendency. And this was one reason why they were inferior, because Turks were homosexual. Now look how, so they considered themselves as superior because they were not. Now we see that these values have evolved. That they're open to it, but Turks and Muslims and they're not open to it. So it's sort of like, when we were kids, we had these punching bags that they come right back up. No matter how it works there at the top, no matter how the values may change, but that flexible positional superiority exists. Or, for example, in the past, European women were considered to be superior because they were more modestly dressed than African and American, not United States, American people in America, they were less modestly dressed and so on, and therefore they were superior. But now they're superior because they're more open to, women are more free to dress as they like. So again, it's this positional superiority. And again, I'm not saying that the West is inferior or anything like that. I'm saying we have our own problems, the world. But since Western hegemony is so powerful, this Islamophobia, this Orientalism is the most important problem that we're facing today. Otherwise, if it was reversed, if somehow Muslims were empowered and we were carrying out the same sort of oppression, that would be the priority that we would have to deal with in some, let's say, hypothetical situation. And finally, I'd like to point out that in the United States, it's different from Europe. But the United States, as some people here would know quite well, they have their own way of dealing with the Muslim problem. The FBI visits you at your place of work, you lose your job. Or the FBI visits people in your community and tells them about their visa problems, and well, if you cooperate with us and tell us about how evil certain people are, your visa problem can be solved. Or the IRS comes and looks into your files and finds that you had this $2 mistake in your tax returns, and you can go to jail for that. And so they have their own, I'm not saying non-Western countries don't have this, and so on and so forth, but I'm saying that since we're talking about this specific topic, I don't want to, target practice on one part of the world, but this is a problem that does exist.
Okay, I'm going to close the session. I would like to thank all panelists. It was very informative and I learned a lot, to be honest. I'm sure our students and guests as well. And thank you for your answers. And I would like to thank the audience for patience and participation. I think Professor Erhan is going to present certain souvenirs from our university. And our next session is, I think, around 30 minutes. Okay, 30 minutes break.
Thank you very much, everybody, for a great panel. I want to thank Dr. İçener for moderating this session and for the panels for really great presentations. And we'd just like to give them, our plates with our CIGA emblem on it. So we'll start with Dr. Green. Dr. Erdenir. Dr. Marandi.
Doğru, sen geç abi.
And Dr. İçener.
Şöyle, ben de şöyle.
Our next session will start 11:50 in about 20 minutes.